Responsibility is a burden. If all our worries and responsibilities just disappeared one day, we would all be happier, right? Well, unfortunately, we are responsible for more things in our life and in the world than we may realize. So while we may be happier without it, handling it properly instead of ignoring it would mean the best for everyone. Firewatch is a first-person adventure game by Campo Santo, where the player is thrust into the slowly disassembling life of a middle-aged man named Henry. After his wife, Julia, is diagnosed with dementia, their plans for the future, namely having children, quickly get sidelined by her worsening condition. Henry then takes a fire lookout job in the Shoshone National Forest to get away from his quickly growing responsibilities, where he has several questionable encounters and uncovers suspicious conspiracies, including that of a former lookout and his child. The motif of children comes up regularly throughout the game, and through the characters' views on them, it suggests their close association with immense responsibility that they seem to fear or are unprepared for in their own ways. That being said, Firewatch uses the motif of children to represent responsibility and the need to be prepared to shoulder it, lest be ruined by it. And by the way, spoilers for basically the whole game. You have been warned. The motif of children makes its first appearance in the opening sequence, with Henry and Julia discussing their future plans of having, quote-unquote, a couple little idiots. Kids. Next, they are referred to by Delilah, the fire lookout supervisor, who reminisces about a former lookout named Ned Goodwin, who brought his son. And finally, the discovery that that son, Brian, fell to his death in a climbing accident. Whether in joyful or tragic contexts, the topic of children come up in different parts of the game, and through the characters' conversations about them, we get a measure of their view on the topic. Henry, for instance, does not seem to take the idea seriously, putting it off or being indifferent when his wife brings it up. It should be noted, however, that when Julia brings up the idea of children in the opening sequence, the player can actually choose whether Henry is indifferent or welcoming to it. But for the sake of this argument, Henry is chosen to be indifferent. Either way, the inclusion of this choice suggests that the devs intended for the player to be able to shape Henry in this way. On the other hand, Delilah seems to enjoy children, and grew to care about Brian, admiring even his youthful wonder. However, she may have grown too lenient with him, considering she was willing to look past the strict rules of forbidding children as fire lookouts in the first place, a mistake that would come back to haunt her. And Ned, Brian's father, who is a war veteran suffering from PTSD, simply wanted to spend time with his son during the summer. Although, based on the extremities of his actions, which you can find out about in my previous Firewatch video, and what little dialogue we get from him, the scars of war have clearly not yet healed, and he was not emotionally ready to handle the responsibility of taking care of a child. Through their views on children, the player is given insight into how the characters then view responsibility. Henry, adopting an indifferent approach to the idea of children, doesn't treat responsibility with the weight that it deserves. When his wife is diagnosed with dementia, he first turns to drink, and then outright runs away from his problems, instead of being there to care for her, despite how difficult it might be. Delilah, being too caring and lenient with Brian, has the same relaxed approach to rules, especially when it comes to her fire lookout job, which seems to be quite the responsibility, ensuring that an entire forest doesn't burn down. The night Henry first meets Delilah, she reveals that she was actually drunk during their first exchange. Drinking on the job seems pretty irresponsible. And yes, a fire lookout job isn't the most exciting job out there, but being drunk to introduce your new recruit to his station says more about Delilah than it does about the job. As for Ned, his unpreparedness to handle the care of his son led him to fear the idea of taking responsibility for his actions. Towards the end of the game, Ned confesses to Henry that Brian fell in a climbing accident, arguing that he simply didn't do it right. He feared going back home and explaining to his wife why he returned without their son. He feared preparing a funeral. He feared coping not just with his loss, but the responsibility of admitting his mistakes, the climbing accident, and bringing Brian with him in the first place. The game treats the way the characters view children as indication of how ready or unready they are to deal with the responsibility, since raising children is in itself a massive undertaking. Thus, based on these characters, the game identifies at least 3 qualities that handling responsibility requires to ensure the best for everyone. maturity, emotional intelligence, and emotional stability, qualities that Henry, Delilah, and Ned all lack in their own ways. Henry lacks maturity and emotional intelligence, seen from his avoidance to deal with serious topics and with his problems. Ned obviously lacks emotional stability and intelligence because of his PTSD, and Delilah seems to be way too relaxed about rules, even though they're there for good reason, which can be thought of as a lack of maturity. The game argues that their lack of these three qualities mean that any endeavor involving responsibility ends, more or less, in tragedy. The forest burning down on Delilah's watch, Henry being forced to let go of his fantasy, and finding Brian dead at the bottom of a cavern.
He was stationed in Two Forks, your lookout, with his dad Ned 3 summers ago. Great kid.
You can bring children out here?
No. You know, I'm not a stickler for rules. They took off halfway through the summer.
Through a lens of responsibility, one could argue that Firewatch is simply a story of how children can change everything in life, and Brian Goodwin would be the best example of that. After having several weird and unexplained things happening to him and Delilah in this forest that had become his escape, Henry had formed such grand theories of his conspiracy about the forest piece by piece, until it all comes crashing down upon discovering the truth. After realizing that there was nothing more to the conspiracy than Ned trying to hide the secret of his son, Henry's dreams of escaping his problems in this forest burned down with the now blazing Shoshone. The game uses this to depict, metaphorically, how plans and hopes for the future often get waylaid by children when one isn't ready for the responsibility. The dichotomy of children is one of joys and hardships, seen quite clearly from Brian's effect on the characters. Delilah brightens when she speaks of Brian to Henry, recounting his youthful innocence and sense of adventure. As the player explores the forest, they discover glimpses of Brian's imaginative mind, like a makeshift fort he constructed, fully equipped with a myriad of things one would expect from a young boy. He had a sense of adventure, a good heart, and unfortunately a father who wasn't ready to care for him. Brian's tragic death thus shows the extreme hardships that can potentially come with having children. Ned chose to seclude himself in the forest like a hermit, and Delilah seemed inconsolable after hearing the news, choosing to give up the fire lookout job after being evacuated. Taking on responsibility too soon, whether it be due to unpreparedness or overeagerness, is a detriment to all involved and may even end in tragedy, such as in the case of Brian Goodwin. Although this is a fictional story with fictional characters and circumstances that most likely wouldn't occur in real life, worse and more tragic things have happened to people. The same people who mirror the characters in Firewatch, or rather, people whom the characters in Firewatch reflect. People who are unprepared to handle responsibility when it comes their way, and end up only reaping the consequences. The characters in Firewatch give a pretty great masterclass on how not to handle and view responsibility. Henry, Delilah, and Ned all ran from theirs at some point and in their own ways, all a result of them simply not being ready, whether that be due to lack of maturity, emotional intelligence, or stability. They all failed to recognize they were not ready, so when the time came for them to shoulder it, tragedy struck swiftly and mercilessly. The game thus argues that timing is everything when it comes to accepting any responsibility. Too early and you won't be ready for it. Too late and you just might miss the opportunity. Accepting it at the right time can mean the difference between it being a burden and a blessing, because although having more responsibility is more work, it does often translate into more benefits as well. Think about a CEO, for example. No, not him. I don't like him. Not really better. Think about a CEO, for example. They have a tremendous amount of responsibility, making decisions, with several people to manage, carrying the company on their backs, but they're often the face and name of it, and get paid an extraordinary amount of money. And a parent, responsible for the precious, fragile life of another human being, which can be an extremely daunting task when it's put that way. But imagine the joy of hearing a baby's first laugh, seeing them take their first steps, watching them grow up. There must be nothing quite like it. Handling responsibility is about finding that silver lining, the border between blessing and burden, and balancing oneself in between. For it is in this balance where one can truly recognize the weight of their responsibility, where one can determine if they are ready or not. Because if they aren't, like the characters in Firewatch, everyone involved will suffer. But if they are, wondrous change is right around the corner. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you want to say something in response to my thoughts or otherwise, do so in the comments down below. Thank you so much to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are so awesome with the donations. Really appreciate it. And finally, if you want to support me, subscribe. See more content like this. One more Firewatch video essay on the way. Other than that, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.